I've been a volunteer in the youth ministry at my church for 24 years. There's so much I love about my church, including the worship services, which fit my stylistic preferences, super casual with a modern music. I could spend a lot of time explaining to you the awesome things about my church. But there's one thing that has bugged me for a very long time, and it especially bugged me when my own two kids were teenagers. As is often the case in many churches, it sometimes feels a little bit like a shopping mall where families drive up together and then all go their separate ways. My two kids were as active as one could be in our youth ministry during their teenage years. Both played in student worship bands, participated weekly in a small group, and attended everything the youth ministry offered. But because the youth ministry at my church is mostly isolated from the rest of the church, my kids graduated without knowing adults in the church other than those who, like you good people, were serving in the youth ministry. And even though the main church services at my church are extremely age appropriate and accessible for teenagers, no teenagers attended. In fact, they were mostly prevented from attending big church because there was youth ministry programming at the same time. Reflecting back to the experience of my son Max, it's clear that there were two critical experiences pertaining to our church that shaped who he would become, and neither of them were aspects of the youth ministry that he was so committed to. The first of those experiences was when Max was a sixth grader and he started participating in a weekly homeless ministry based out of our church. There weren't very many teenagers involved and there were no middle schoolers. We had to ask the guy in charge if it was okay for Max to attend. But Max served alongside young adults and middle-aged people and was treated as an equal, someone with something to offer. The second experience that really shaped him was the 2 weeks he spent in Haiti on a multi-generational trip where he was part of running a music day camp for child slaves. It wasn't a youth ministry trip. In fact, the youth ministry at our church had nothing to do with it. Once again, Max wasn't treated as the future of the church, but as a co-participant with something meaningful to contribute. Here's a strong statement to kind of get us going. We'll see long-term faith more often when we work to decrease the constant ghettoization of teenagers and help them find meaningful belonging in the life of the church. Somewhere along the superhighway of youth ministry professionalization, many of us bought into the idea that it's in the best interest of teenagers in terms of their spiritual development to separate them from the rest of the congregation. In many ways, we were just mirroring our culture, which has progressively moved toward almost complete isolation of teenagers from the world of adults over the last 50 years. Here's a short list of some interconnected factors that are broader than church, but are mirrored by many of our churches when it comes to our youth ministry approaches. The isolation of teenagers, the increasing infantilization of teenagers, that means treating them as if they were children. New brain research showing that teenagers' decision-making brain parts are underdeveloped, being interpreted as a disability rather than divinely intended opportunity. The swing toward helicopter parenting, the loss of public spaces where teenagers are allowed to hang out together, the lack of jobs for teenagers that involve interaction with adults in the world of adults. All of these factors working together are negatively impacting teenagers in lots of ways. And then here's this little bit of, I apologize, it's a cynical observation. Isolating teenagers in our churches sometimes feels like a win-win-win. Feels like a win for the teenagers themselves who would seemingly, so we think at least, prefer to hang out with a homogeneous grouping rather than getting stuck with a bunch of old farts. It feels like a win for professional youth workers because it justifies the existence of our jobs and makes us more and more indispensable. And then it feels like a win for many in our congregation who really do genuinely want teenagers to grow in their faith and have a good experience of church, but would rather not have to interact with them. It's easier to show our support by financing an isolated youth group than by actually being involved with teenagers. Teenagers today live almost their entire day-to-day lives in an isolated bubble with only their peers. They spend a big chunk of their time in school, where the only adults who are there with them are paid to be there with them in the world of teenagers, however pure and noble teachers' motives may be. In off-school hours, they're hanging out with peers in real life or online. They're playing sports again with peers, or working at a starter job where they're likely supervised by a 20-something in extended adolescence. The phenomenon of extended adolescence, by the way, is directly tied to this isolation. In our culture, teenagers no longer have an opportunity to spend time with adults in the world of adults. And as a result, they've never had a chance to be what I'd call an apprentice adult. Compare this to 100 years ago. Not that I'm at all interested in idealizing that era or returning to it. But 100 years ago, older teenagers and young adults spent the majority of their time living and working alongside adults, learning by observation and trying on what it means to be an adult. On-ramps to adulthood have been almost completely shut down, and young adults are left to their own difficult explorations about how to take responsibility for their own lives. Sadly, we've done the same thing in church. In our march to perfect the youth group, we've often isolated teenagers from adults in the church, or any opportunity to engage or be engaged by the church at large. No wonder teenagers have no idea how to make the transition from youth group to the larger church when they graduate. Christian Smith's research and then Kenda Dean's application of that research for the Christian church in her stellar book, Almost Christian, it helps reveal the problems of this approach. Sensing a meaningful connection and belonging to the larger church body and not just youth group is one of the few prime indicators of a church engagement that outlasts adolescence. In fact, Smith's research showed that the primary reason Mormons kick our butts in terms of faith retention in people leaving their teenage years is due to the fact that Mormon churches expect teenagers to participate fully as equals in their weekly church services. But there's positive movement on this issue. I meet youth workers every week who are wrestling with this problem. It's not an easy one, particularly in a church where there's a long established tradition of isolating the teenagers. People don't tend to like change. Youth workers across the country are experimenting with breaking down this isolation. Youth workers in their churches are taking baby steps in the right direction. Maybe your church already has teenagers sitting in the pews around you during worship. Good. Now, how can you ramp up engagement, not only for the formation of teenagers, but because our congregations need what teenagers have to offer? Just the other day, I heard something brilliant. Teenagers aren't human becomings, they're human beings. And of course, this problem should be addressed outside of our church services also, creating opportunities for teens to rub shoulders with regular old adults while serving together. My dad spent years volunteering in Detroit doing house rehab, and when he was in his early 80s, the junior high director at his church asked him if he would consider going on a junior high mission trip where they'd be doing that exact same work. My dad called me in a panic, and he said, "I don't want to say no, but it seems crazy. Those junior high kids don't want an old man hanging around, and I would have no idea what to say to them." I said, "Dad, teach them how to hold a hammer and how to sink a nail in 2 or 3 swings, and you'll do great." He went, and not only am I positive he had a huge impact on some junior hires, it was a big spiritual shot in the arm for my 80-something dad. When we integrate teenagers into the life of the church, everyone wins. And while I'm not suggesting that you necessarily try this next idea, as I don't know your context, I've seen quite a few churches making the bold move to discontinue Sunday morning programming, Sunday school, because they realize, at least for high schoolers, they're no longer attending 2 hours and they'd rather have students participate actively in the main church service. By the way, this is best accomplished with a concurrent effort to involve teenagers in the church service, not merely hoping they'll sit there. Let me be really clear. I hope it's obvious I'm not lobbying for the discontinuation of age-specific youth ministry in churches. Teenagers still need safe places to be their authentic self in relationship with peers who are wrestling with the same issues. But age-segregated youth ministry and integration don't have to be an either-or issue. It should be a both-and commitment, with a priority on finding ways to move toward integration. The best youth ministries, those that are really thriving, and by thriving I mean those ministries creating disciples who continue in faith beyond their years in youth group, those youth ministries are finding creative ways to embrace integration. Let's land the plane this way. I want you to consider reimagining your role. Instead of youth group volunteer, let me give you two metaphorical job titles to consider. The first one's a little bit weird. It's this: gadfly. One definition of a gadfly, in addition to the literal fly that bugs horses, a gadfly is an annoying person, especially one who provokes others into action. How can you be the best sort of gadfly, annoying your church toward the inclusion of teenagers? And if that idea is a little too weird for you, maybe this one would work better for you as a volunteer. Be a banner waver for teenagers. You know those tall banners that some businesses have out front, mounted on a pole and announcing something important? Imagine that you have one of those banners and on it is printed, "Remember the teenagers in our midst." And during your church's services, you would run around the congregation. This is just the vision, right? Run around the congregation waving this banner. I suppose it's just another way of being a gadfly, annoying your church toward the inclusion of teenagers. There are plenty of things we need to work on to stem the tide of teenagers graduating from faith when they graduate from our youth groups. But maybe the most important of those practices is taking steps away from the isolation of teenagers. Boldly embracing a conviction and practice that says both teenagers need our whole church and our whole church needs teenagers.
I love me some Marko. As I was taking notes, first thing I wrote is, this could be uncomfortable. But I love how Marko challenges us to wrestle with things that sometimes are uncomfortable. As I think about his wording, he's actually been kind of was it a gadfly? He's kind of a gadfly. Like every year we ask him to participate in this training for volunteers, and he does have a way of kind of stirring the pot and making us think, and yet giving us grace as we find our way. And I love how deeply he cares about youth ministry. And for me, I'm actually currently the youth pastor at a church that made this integration decision a few years ago, and we stopped having high school students meet during the church service. And there was immediate pushback. And in some cases, it was, and actually still is, a little controversial with both parents and teenagers. You know, parents who want their kids involved in the youth ministry type setting, and it pushes at high school students who actually don't want to go to what they call the adult service. And as Marko said, there has been a long established tradition of isolating teenagers. And for you as a volunteer, you may not have the power or authority to initiate this change. But what I love that Marko suggested is that you can wave the banner for the church to be on the lookout for teenagers in the midst, and train other adults and begin thinking about how they can invite and can include teenagers. Tell everyone you know in the church the stories of great teenagers doing great things. Tell them to your friends, tell them to other ministry leaders, tell them to your senior pastors, and celebrate teenagers. Why? Because teenagers aren't the future of the church, right? They are the church of today, and we need the whole church, and the whole church needs teenagers. One very practical action you could take is to invite a teenager to sit with you in the church service that if he or she doesn't have parents who attend. Because everyone wants to be invited somewhere, so extend an invitation and you can help with the integration one student at a time. That's a small action that actually may yield a lifelong faith. Okay, you've got choices. You can discuss the questions on the screen or in the notebook. You can go to the bathroom. You can take a mini nap. You can go for a short walk, but we'll see you back in a few minutes.